The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the January 2018 Community IT Innovators webinar. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on nonprofit IT trends for the coming year. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm the President and CEO of Community IT and the moderator for this series. I'm happy to be joined today by several of our most experienced and talented leadership team for this roundtable discussion. So with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce Johanny Torrico, our Vice President of Operations. Hello, Johanny.
Hello.
Hello. We're joined by Steve Longenecker, our Director of IT Consulting. Hello, Steve.
And good afternoon, everybody.
And finally, our CTO, Matthew Eshelman, is with us today as well. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Johan. Thanks for facilitating and looking forward to our conversation today.
Great. Well, before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our company. In case you're not familiar with us, Community IT is a 100% employee-owned company, and our team of nearly 40 staff is dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We are technology experts, and we have been consistently named one of the top 200 managed service providers in North America, an honor that we received again in 2017. So now, without further ado, let's begin today's presentation and discussion on the trends that we see in 2018. And I want to say right off the bat that this is not going to be a summary of the CES conference. I don't know if any of you saw, this is Forpheus, a robot playing ping pong table. So the trends that we're talking about today are not going to be sort of the futuristic extremes of what technology can accomplish. It might be helpful for us to look at the now famous Gartner hype cycle. So this is kind of the typical path that technology takes, where there's some technology trigger, and that's often what you see at CES. There's new advances in whether it's laser technology or screen technology, microprocessors, that creates new opportunities for technical innovation. And that leads to this peak of inflated expectations where everyone's assuming that the new technology solutions are going to create all kinds of new amazing opportunities with technology. That turns into the trough of disillusionment when things don't play out the way we expect them to. But then eventually we do figure out how to use the technology, and that leads us into this plateau of productivity. So today we're hoping to find ourselves somewhere on the slope of enlightenment, and we're going to be talking about solutions that you may already be familiar with. We'll be talking about some technologies that may be new to you, but more than anything else, we're going to look at how these technologies are really going to be impactful at nonprofit organizations over the next year. So we're going to start off by talking about cloud. As you're all familiar with cloud, I'm assuming, and security. In fact, all of these trends may be things that you're familiar with already, but we're going to do a deep dive into what's changing in these different areas and what to look for in the coming year. So now I'm going to hand it over to Johanny to talk a little bit more about the cloud.
Yes, thank you, Johan. Well, Johan, you want to know something? The cloud trend continues.
All right.
Cloud computing, yeah, it's here to stay. Cloud computing adoption continues to grow, and according to a Forbes report, organizations will dedicate 80% of their IT budgets to the cloud. And we have actually seen this trend with our own clients. First, it was the move of email to the cloud, where I would say 95% of our clients went through this change. And now we're seeing some of our clients focusing on moving files to a cloud environment, be it Office 365, Dropbox, or Box. You can go back, Johan, to that one. That's fine. And honestly, it is not a surprise, given that several benefits organizations get when they successfully move to the cloud, right? Benefits such as increased efficiency, ease of access, simpler administration, and overall lower cost. But with all the buzz around cloud technology, organizations are having to adapt quickly to an ever-changing landscape. So we can go to the next slide. I see three critical effects cloud computing is having in organizations. The first one is that users are driving the cloud evolution. Cloud vendors are rapidly changing. They have to keep up with this user-driven market. They have to if they want to compete with other cloud providers. Second, cloud computing is changing organizations' environments. In some cases, organizations no longer need servers or network storage devices. And third, there's so many changes to keep up with that organizations have to rethink the relationship with their IT providers. They don't need the classic break-fix support anymore. They need an IT provider that helps them make the best decision in all of these changes. Next slide. First, user experience trumps product. You can see more and more that user experience is driving improvements across all products that compete within the cloud arena. Users are looking at cloud services across vendors. They don't care if it's Google, Dropbox, Microsoft, or any of the big players. Users are looking for tighter integration between the cloud, their critical applications, and their local systems. It is not about the product anymore. It's about how these products can help users simplify their work and how these products can help organizations become more productive and mobile. In integration, Microsoft has a tremendous advantage over the other cloud products. The majority of users work within the Microsoft ecosystem. They use Windows computers and rely heavily on the Office Productivity Suite. In integration, Microsoft has a big lead among the other cloud providers, as integration is becoming seamless for users that live within the Microsoft environment. And not only that, but Microsoft is also crossing the bridge to better integration with Apple products. Their Office Suite for Macs, for example, is closing out to what you can do with a Windows device. And to add to all this, the user experience is not only focusing on application integration these days, but also access integration. With so many cloud services out there, how can we integrate access so that the user has a better experience? And with this, we have seen an increasing number of requests for single sign-on solutions, being Microsoft Azure AD or Okta, a third-party solution that also offers non-profit pricing. And more to come on single sign-on later in this presentation. So with all this disruption and change that the cloud is bringing, it's not a surprise that organizations' environments are also changing, and they are changing quickly. Next slide, please. Really, this is not news, but something very important to note. Moving to the cloud means less servers or no servers for some organizations. They no longer have to spend their dollars on upgrading their server infrastructure every 4 to 5 years. Instead, organizations have to invest on enterprise-level solutions for better access and ongoing cost. A lot of critical applications, accounting applications, donor databases, CRMs are available in the cloud these days. And organizations are seeing the many advantages to move their critical data to the cloud for easier access, for more uptime, all of those known benefits that the cloud brings. All this is driving organizations to make decisions on ways to improve internet access in their offices, increasing speeds, and providing better ways for users to connect wirelessly. One thing that often gets overlooked is that increasing speeds is important, but equally important is to be able to provide a reliable way to connect throughout the office. It is super important to invest on enterprise-level solutions that will provide what users need to work effectively and efficiently. It is definitely worth the cost. And I'm talking about better laptops, better wireless, more access points, business-level internet, secure access. Also, another thing to consider is single sign-on solution to ease access to all the cloud apps your users need. This also adds a level of security you will want to have. Another overlooked thing is backups. Cloud does not equal backups. If your email is on the cloud, your files are on the cloud, all the critical data lives on the cloud, you will want to have a cloud backup solution in place. Cloud providers have some retention policies, but that's not a backup solution. And as you can see, there are a lot of things to consider and think through when moving to the cloud. Not only the cloud is always changing, trying to meet user requirements, the organization environment needs to adjust, but also the IT needs of the organization are also evolving. And that takes me to my third point. With the adoption of the cloud, organizations are presented with an ever-increasing number of cloud technologies. All these different cloud products and different needs, looking for better productivity tools, looking for tighter integration, for better ways to access all of their cloud applications, having to select the right cloud backup solution, single sign-on options. All these needs are changing the landscape of what organizations are looking for in an IT provider. IT support is no longer just about keeping the lights on. With cloud computing, the responsibility of keeping the lights on is now the job of the cloud service provider. Instead, IT providers, managed service providers are now focusing on helping organizations understand how to effectively use the various capabilities that cloud computing provides. The focus also shifts to the application and it turns away from infrastructure management. This changes the way IT departments organize themselves. Another mistake that is often made is to assume that because the focus is not on the application and the management of them is, for the most part, self-service, that these cloud technologies are simple to manage. This is totally not true. In fact, with all the cloud options, having those cloud options, having that to play nicely with your local environment, creating a hybrid environment in some cases, IT is in fact now more complex to manage. And so organizations are facing the need to partner with IT providers that can understand the organization needs, the organization vision. They're looking to partner with IT providers that can help them make strategic decisions on how to utilize these cloud solutions better and how to manage them. We actually have seen a trend on organizations looking more seriously to IT providers to become their trusted advisor and strategic partners as they transform to the cloud. And my last point, another trend that I see, you can go to the next slide. Another trend that I see for 2018 is that Microsoft will continue working on taking the lead. And I don't think I'm being bold with this prediction. Microsoft continues to improve their cloud umbrella Office 365. We have seen this with Office Online, where every month they're releasing new features to get Office Online closer to the Office desktop versions. We're also seeing an effort to improve on their mobile apps, not only with the Office apps, but also apps for SharePoint, OneDrive, Delve. A recent example is the changes on how files sync locally in your computer from Office 365. You can switch to the next slide. Last year, Microsoft released, to the next one, please. Microsoft released on-demand syncing with their Windows 10 Fall Creator release, and Steve will tell us more about this later. But Microsoft also continues to invest in the productivity line, with Office 365 groups, Teams, Skype for Business, and working on all of them to integrate them better within their Office 365 ecosystem. They have invested a lot on business intelligence and automation with Power Apps, Microsoft Flows, Power BI. As I mentioned before, they do have a tremendous advantage on this cloud market. The majority of us work within Windows. We use their Office Productivity Suite. Microsoft has a big lead, definitely, among other players, as integration is becoming seamless for users that are within the Microsoft environment. And like I mentioned, Microsoft is also trying hard to better integrate with Apple products. I have a Mac. I use Microsoft Office for Macs, and I love it. We also We have also seen their SSO application, Azure AD, working great for some of our clients that are making the transition to all cloud, and they are opening charity pricing to some of their top line cloud enterprise level technologies. Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit about Microsoft and the improvements they're making to Office 365?
Sure. So as Johanny, as you mentioned, when I thought back when Johan asked me to think about trends and what's happened in 2017 and what's happening in 2018, I did feel like the OneDrive sync client changes were perhaps the things I was most excited about. So it wasn't that many years ago that OneDrive for Business, one of its big downsides was that the OneDrive sync client was very clunky and it often broke. So sometime in the last 18 months, they maybe even 24 months, they released a new client that didn't break, which was great. But as Johanny mentioned, they now have what they call OneDrive Files on Demand. And full disclosure, this is something that I first saw on the Dropbox for Business platform, where when you're syncing a cloud library, your OneDrive library, it syncs. You see all those files in File Explorer. That's the idea of a sync client, so that you can interact with them locally. You don't have to go to a web browser to see your files. You can just look in Windows File Explorer. But now with Files on Demand, you see everything that's in your OneDrive for Business cloud library, but you only see it as a the name of the file, the icon that of, you know, if it's a Word document, the Word icon, when it was last modified, when it was created, all that stuff that shows up in a File Explorer view if you're looking at the details pane. But the icon has a little cloud on it, indicating that you don't actually have the contents of the file downloaded yet. So it doesn't take up any space on your hard drive. And this is a really big, and this is an important feature, because obviously, particularly with laptops, the hard drives can be much smaller than perhaps what you're syncing. OneDrive for Business, people don't necessarily have tons and tons of stuff, but it allows for a whole terabyte of storage in your OneDrive for Business store. And then if you start also syncing, and you can use the OneDrive for Business sync client to sync SharePoint libraries, groups libraries, teams libraries, all these things can be synced to your local drive. And it's great now that they don't have to be, the contents don't have to be synced. So if you have a very large PowerPoint file, for example, you see that file, you see you might see the folder, you can navigate down to it, but until you double click on it, it doesn't actually download. You can, if you do double click on it, then it downloads and you open it, and then it stays local unless you right click on it and choose to make cloud only again. So that's a really big deal. Of course, you still can sync things up locally ahead of, like, say, an airplane trip where you know you're going to be offline, because this is something that you can only download on the fly when you're on the internet. In addition, the sync client, this is another big thing that happened in 2017. That's a big thing for me. One of the places Johanny mentioned how strong Microsoft's integration is, because they control the whole stack. You're not just working in the Office 365 cloud, but you're using the Microsoft Office desktop suite software on your computer, whether it's a Mac or a Windows computer. If you double click on a file in your OneDrive for Business sync client and somebody else has also opened that file in their version of Word, it actually can start, it shifts from opening that local synced copy to a streamed copy. So you can actually start co-authoring right off of that. It's just really amazing. I mean, I think some of this stuff I'm talking about may be hard to visualize, and in some ways I should just say it's just amazing and stop with that. But the fact that Microsoft controls their whole stack does allow them to do some amazing technical achievements. And I think what we're seeing with the OneDrive Sync client in 2017 fits with that. Another big thing that they did in Office 365 was that they revamped the way SharePoint libraries are presented. I'd say that the SharePoint design principles that we thought were kind of the way to go 2.5 years ago, we're really revamping them, because SharePoint is continuing to evolve. And what we've learned is that we're going to basically follow Microsoft's lead, and if we do, they're going to evolve in a way that sort of protects us. So we've learned we're not going to do a lot of custom building. We're just going to sort of build within the framework that they present, and then that way they can, as they continue to change things, are the things that we've built on it can keep up with those feature adds. Another thing that we just started playing with in the fall, and I'll give Matt all the credit for doing this. A client asked us to explore it, and so we pursued it. So there's something called information rights management, or IRM, and this is probably not something that just a lot of our clients will want, but I think there will be use cases where it's worth having. So if you are storing your files in the Office 365 cloud, they can exert a lot more control over that stuff, because when you share a file with somebody, if you attach a file that you send to somebody else, in the new Office 365 paradigm, you're not actually attaching the actual file. You're attaching, it looks like an attachment when you get it in Outlook, but it has a little cloud icon on it, and you're actually getting essentially a link to an Office 365 Office 365 server in some data center somewhere. So they can exert all sorts of controls over that. And so Matt was playing with this, and he was sending all of us these links to either OneDrive for Business, probably OneDrive for Business files from his Office 365 account, or maybe they're from SharePoint. But because he had put information rights management restrictions on them, I could open the file, I could see the file, but I couldn't download the file, I couldn't forward the email that he sent me. I couldn't copy from the file. Like when I tried to copy, it wouldn't let me. I couldn't even take screenshots, which really floored me. So I recognized the fact that I could have always got my phone out and taken a picture of the screen. I mean, it's not like it's foolproof, but I was still impressed. And I think it certainly goes a long way to controlling data leakage, if that's important. We were piloting Microsoft Office 365 Teams in the fall with a project. I put that on as something that I think Microsoft's going to continue to invest in. It's more or less, I think all the critics have said it's more or less a response to the popularity of Slack, which is kind of a chat-based workspace that's not owned by Microsoft. And so they've bundled a bunch of different Office 365 services together into these things called Teams. We played with it on a project. It definitely worked for us, but I think that it's still a maturing product, and we're not pushing it on any of our clients at all. And then I think this has come up in other webinars, but I think Office 365 Find Time is a hidden gem that we always want to keep reminding our webinar listeners about. So it's a plugin for at least Outlook web access. That's how I've used it. And if you want to set up a meeting with colleagues who are part of your Office 365 organization, you can just look at their free busy. That's been available for years now. But if you want to set up a meeting with someone who's not in your organization, then you don't necessarily have any access to their calendar. So this Find Time applet allows you to send maybe 4 options or 5. I mean, the options is obviously up to you, but you can send them a bunch of options that you are available to them or to a group of people, and they click on the link that's sent to them in this email, and it presents all of the different times, and they can vote yes, no, or preferred, and they can see other people's votes, and it actually reserves all the time on your calendars as like hold for, it says. And then when all the votes are in, or enough votes are in, then you can pick the one you want, and then it actually turns that into an actual meeting request and cleans up the old holds, and it's slick. Of course, I sent it to a client that included an executive director and his chief of operations, and the chief of operations immediately emailed back to both of us, well, I'm going to wait for the executive director to vote because my time's more flexible than his. And I was like, that's not the point. But and then the executive director never responded because apparently he was too busy. So technology doesn't solve everything, but it's still Find Time. Look for it if you haven't seen it yet. On the next slides, Johanny mentioned already that the cloud has meant that, among other things, it might mean that we are expecting to see more and more serverless networks. We used to say if you had less than 5 seats that you really don't need a server, and then somewhere maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago we said 10. We're really bumping it up. So we helped a client in 2017, 40 plus staff, decommission their remaining on-premise servers. We did set up a domain controller in Microsoft Azure. It was like, what would they call infrastructure as a service situation. So it's a virtual machine that's hosted in the Microsoft Azure data center somewhere. And so there was a domain controller for that. By the way, we've mentioned this before as well, but there is a $5,000 per year credit for Azure services. This is separate from Office 365, but if you're eligible for nonprofit charity pricing for Office 365 services, you are also eligible for credit towards up to $5,000 a year for Azure services, which can be useful not just for infrastructure as a service, but also storage space for backup sometimes, all that kind of thing. It's definitely something to think about. But yeah, in addition to that domain controller, we actually started joining remote users directly to their Azure Active Directory and started managing their computers with instead of normally, and this is technical, I'm sorry, but normally you would manage domain computers with something called group policy. And now we're seeing sort of a substitute for that through the cloud. And again, it's an example of where Microsoft owns the cloud service Intune, but they also own the Windows operating system. So they know that we can't manage Mac computers with Azure Intune, but we can definitely manage Windows computers with Azure Intune. And we're expecting this to be a trend. We're going to see larger and larger clients moving away from servers as they're able to move files into Office 365 file stores, whether that's SharePoint or OneDrive for Business or groups or teams, and we'll see the management of the computers through cloud services as well.
All right, thank you, Steve. So that concludes the cloud trend. But as you notice, there's a lot of overlap. Some of the trends that we're seeing in cloud have to do with security. And we're going to turn now to focus more explicitly on security. And 2018 was not even, a month old, and we already have major security concerns. So Matt, can you tell us a little bit more about what you see happening in 2018 with security?
Sure. Yeah, as Johan, as you mentioned, we're not even through the first month of the year, and already we've got, probably like the most fundamental security, vulnerability that's been discovered yet. This essentially affects every processor that's been manufactured in the last 10 or 15 years. Microsoft and Apple have released patches for most of their operating systems, and Intel's working with vendors to provide additional fixes to completely update and provide protection against these vulnerabilities. So it's this is a really unique situation in terms of the severity of this threat, but it, I think, continues a trend that we've seen. So we can take a look at, I think we kind of started off last year saying, hey, security, this is going to be the year of security as being a top priority, and I think that continues. Looking back over 2017, I mean, we saw and observed, demonstrable attacks against all of our clients. So essentially, if you've got a computer or if you've got an account online, you're a target. And I think the new thing in 2017 was we saw a pretty dramatic increase in the number of successful credential thefts. So that's when your credentials for your email or your web database or your network account would be compromised, and then the attacker would then kind of pivot and then kind of make moves to take data, to email contacts, to launch additional schemes, kind of using that information. We'll say anecdotally, it seemed like last year we've seen a little bit less success in terms of the actual virus activity that was there. I think it's been more than offset by the amount of credential theft. I assume that that's a little bit of interplay between the success of antivirus vendors, improving their detection algorithms and being able to prevent things, and then attackers kind of moving and finding additional attack vectors into the networks. But security, I think, was very active in 2017, and I expect that trend will continue into 2018. And indeed, kind of starting off the year, we're really, working hard to get patching out and to update things so that we're protected against this pretty significant vulnerability that affects essentially every modern computer device that we have. So as we move on, this was a slide that I picked up from the RSA security conference that I attended last year, and it's helped me to think a little bit more about kind of motivations and why are people doing the things they are when it comes to security and attacking networks. So this presenter has had this kind of hackernomics term. This is a social science concerned with description, analysis of attacker motivations, the economics and business risks, and they categorized it by 5 laws and then 4 corollaries. And so I think this is just helpful in terms of, as we looked at the next slide, to kind of see what those laws are, to understand, what is the new security landscape. And I think it's important to understand that most of the attackers aren't evil or insane. They just want something, and I think the evolution there is, the attackers are not kind of our stereotype of, a pimply faced teenager in their parents' basement, kind of hacking for fun. These are often, nation state actors, well-funded, well-resourced, well-trained, automated tools, essentially checking all the doors to see what they can get access to. So, and again, we don't necessarily have the budget to protect against, really specific targeted attacks that where a specific person or nation state is targeting you as an entity. I mean, the DNC is kind of an example of that. They were specifically targeted because of who they were. So maybe the attacks would have happened even if they would have been paying more attention. But so we don't necessarily have unlimited budget to protect against all security threats. But we do want to mitigate that risk. So we really want to lower the risk that we have as an organization against being a victim of a lot of these drive-by attacks. It's important, again, we really want to focus on metrics, like what is actually a threat, what is actually a risk to us as an organization in our scenario, not, hey, I heard this is, this happened to my friend, or this is the most recent thing that happened to us as an organization, but looking at metrics as a way to make decisions around how we protect ourselves, where we make investments in technology for our organizations. Again, most of the breaches come from failures, not from hacker ingenuity. We see that the credential thefts or compromises that we have are not because people, the bad guys are cracking some very complex password that is well thought out and varied and unique, but it's the person that hasn't changed their password in 10 years, or an account that was forgotten, or some other scenario where the attacker was successful not because of their kind of ingenuity, but because they have a database of millions of passwords and your password happened to be on it because you haven't changed it. So that's kind of the most likely scenario that we see. And this kind of comes down into, okay, so what do we do? The security world seems kind of big and scary, and you just want to throw your hands up. But we want to make sure that we're really focusing on fundamentals, really focusing on education of staff, so that they can make good decisions around the technology that they're using, how they're implementing their own security practices, and providing them a good roadmap. And I'll talk a little bit about what are some of those fundamental things that organizations should be doing when it comes to improving their own security. And then finally, attackers don't crack some impenetrable security control. They look for weak points like trusting employees. I think last year was the first year where some of our clients fell victim to a phishing scheme where somebody called up pretending to be community IT, asked for credentials, asked the end user to install some software, and kind of took advantage of so essentially a social engineering attack to prey upon the willingness of staff just to kind of go along, and hey, if somebody from IT calls, usually people are willing to kind of work with them and help out. So we've had to, look at improving our processes and do education around our clients in terms of what is behavior to expect when talking to a technology support person. So this just helps, I think, to provide a little bit more education around the very real and significant security threat that faces all of us as we live in this digital world. So, as we take a look at that, the summary of our security incidents. So this is against our clients. So we work with about 120 organizations throughout the year. And so we had 16, 17 kind of serious security threats. And so that would be, advanced malware, like a crypto type attack, credential theft, we have some fraud, we got roped into some website compromise issues. So you can see the most prominent activity that happened last year was credential theft, and I don't think that we had actually worked on that very much kind of before 2017, but I think that's something we saw a lot of, and I expect that will continue into 2018. So credential theft is particularly damaging because you essentially have to assume that if that person has your credentials, then they have access to everything that you have access to. And what we see is that the credential theft is primarily targeted against executive directors, directors of finance, operations managers, accounts payable people. I think it's indicative of the fact that a lot of these attacks are driven against people with access to money, and so a lot of it is kind of trying to work on wire transfer fraud. And so we'll see an attack where the director of finance has their account compromised, and then the accounts payable person gets an email from them, not even a spoofed email, that says, hey, I need you to wire money to this account to pay this bill. We've seen attackers sit on accounts, reply to emails, so that they're not kind of writing things out of new, they're copying signature lines. So the credential theft is a major risk as an organization, and we're seeing that something that really took off in 2017. And so we are ourselves, and we'll talk about it. What are ways to mitigate against that risk? So as we look at that, the security checklist, I think we try to keep reiterating it, and Johanny started off the presentation. Hey, for security, the first line of defense is having a good backup, cloud included. Microsoft and Sales, all these vendors keep adding in some additional features for some data recovery, but it's still absolutely critical that you have access to your data in a format outside of the primary vendor. There's lots of great cloud backup options out there. You need to have one in place to be truly protected. Patching, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, I think our approach to patching was, hey, we don't want to patch because we're afraid of what may break. And I think that still is a risk, but the model has certainly shifted to, we're now in a patch first model. The bad guys are out there exploiting vulnerabilities in older software. Older software is insecure. And so it's really important that systems are patched the whole way through. And you may not need to install them on the first day that they're released, but patching needs to be a key piece of any security plan. It means people have to reboot their computers. It means maintenance has to be occurred, and this is kind of for all systems. And we see the major vendors taking this on. Microsoft now is much more assertive in their patching. If you're using the Windows Update for Business, they're pretty assertive about patching. I have an iPhone. Apple's always like, I got the little red dot. They always want to update my iPhone overnight, and in general, it's a good idea to follow that. I have this bullet point, a good password, because ideally, if in the enterprise, yeah, you have a good password. You have a good password that you use to get into your computer, and then you can use that password then to leverage access to all your other applications through the use of single sign-on combined with multi-factor authentication. So We've also changed, I think, a recommendation this year to now multi-factor authentication is a requirement. If we're going to be setting up things like this, is something that really needs to be in place. It's the first thing we do whenever somebody gets their account compromised, is reset their password, turn on multi-factor authentication, because that's the best line of defense to protect against hackers who may compromise your credential. Because while a hacker, it's relatively easier to get your password, it's much, much more difficult to get your second authentication factor. So Google Apps, all these systems, have included multi-factor authentication. It's pretty easy to set up. It's easy to use, but this is an uphill battle. And so this is, something that I've been banging the drum on quite a bit in 2017, because if people would have multi-factor authentication, we wouldn't have credential theft. And it's an uphill battle. I think Google just did a report, or Dropbox, only about 10% of the user base had turned on multi-factor authentication. So that's a big area for an opportunity for growth, to improve security, to turn that on, and it really helps a lot, making your organization more secure. And then finally, encryption. See, we're starting to see this in more cases where encryption is turned on, disks on your laptop, on your mobile device, to provide more security in the event that data is lost. It gives you a little bit more control around what happens, and maybe some reporting requirements, particularly if you're an organization that has HIPAA compliance.
So I was going to talk quickly about our experiences with single sign-on and multi-factor, and then pass the baton back to Matt, I think. So 2017 was the year that we did it for ourselves and ate our own dog food, as the expression goes. So this is primarily an Office 365. Community IT is an Office 365 customer, as well as solution provider. And there's a number of different ways that you can have multi-factor authentication set up. It's possible to have, a system where there's a random 6-digit number or 10-digit number, not 10, 6-digit number, 5-digit number changing on your phone that's unique to your phone. When you put that in, it changes every minute, put it in. But with Office 365, it's actually even easier than that. Whenever I sign into a new computer, to Office 365, I put in my username slongenecker@communityit.com, and I put in my password. But then I'm not in until my phone basically beeps within like 10 seconds, and it says, someone's trying to log in to your account. Do you approve or deny? And I would click approve at that point, and then I'm in. And the idea, as Matt said, was that someone can steal my password, but stealing my password and getting a hold of my phone is much harder. It's not impossible. There are, you can imagine that if I was in a spy movie and I was the target of a huge spy agency, that they would figure out how to pull that off. And I don't doubt that. And that was an earlier Hackernomics slide that Matt showed, that we can't defend ourselves against a targeted nation state on us. But if you're just up against people who are looking for the easy money, that you're no longer easy. They're gonna try to, they got your password somehow. They tried it, but then it's asking for the phone to approve, and they don't have the phone, and so they move on to some other target, and they go down the list. By the way, it might be worth saying how people steal those passwords. We saw two things happen. We saw lots of things happen in 2017. Two that come to mind right now that definitely happened. One was where someone was prompted with a link in an email to update their password, and if they clicked on that link, it took them to a page that looked completely appropriate, like it was spoofing the actual page. But if you look at the URL, it was not quite the right URL, but it was I think it might have been an Office 365 sounding URL, but it's like Office space 365 or Office dash 365 or something. So they had gotten this other domain name, and you clicked on it, and then you put your old password in, and you put your new password in twice, and you hit enter, and then they had your old password, and that actually could then be used to get into Office 365. And the next time you actually logged into Office 365, you'd try your new one and it wouldn't work, and you say, huh, that's weird. You try your old one, it would work, and maybe you just go on with life and not realize that you'd given up your password. Another one that happened in 2017. We've all read about, like, you know, Yahoo's had their password compromised, their database has been, you know, was stolen. So like, I used to always use my home address from when I was a kid for my password. This is like for years, for all my passwords, because that was the easiest thing to remember. So now I know that password is I used it for my Yahoo account back in the early 2000s, and so I know that password's now in the hands. It's in a database that people can buy. So if anybody ever connects Steve Longenecker at yahoo.com to S Longenecker communityit.com, and I keep the same password for everything, they can log in as, you know, it's just a matter of sort of matching those things up, and it's not as hard as you might think with computers. Back to the slide, it was also in 2017 that we began using our Office 365 credentials to access other cloud services. And this is what Matt was meaning by a good password. So now that we've made it very difficult to get into Office 365 without having your second factor, your phone on you, and that is a nuisance if you don't have your phone in your pocket. If you're, you know, I think people that have pants with pockets that they carry their phones in are maybe at a small advantage than people who don't and keep their phone in a purse or something. But yeah, so you've made it harder to get into Office 365. Then you can, and this is possible, of all the cloud services, agree to use the same protocol to do single sign-on, and that is becoming pretty common. So when I want to log into IT Glue, which is our documentation system, when I want to log into our HR cloud system where you ask for days off, all of those things, instead of logging in with a separate account, people have this experience on the consumer side with Google. Sometimes you'll log into something and it will say, log in with Facebook or log in with Google, instead of actually putting in a new username and password. And as long as you're already logged into the browser with your single sign-on credentials, it'll let you into that one too. So I log into Office 365, and then when I go to our documentation system, which is in the cloud, and I hit log in, and it says, you know, you're logging in with Office 365, and I say yes, and as long as I'm already in Office 365, it just lets me in. That way I have one difficult to penetrate gate into my cloud world, and all the things are linked off that. There are other advantages to single sign-on, including there's a lot of cloud services that organizations are managing, and having a single platform to get to all of them makes provisioning and deprovisioning them much easier. So when someone leaves an organization, you deprovision their Office 365 credentials, and everything follows from that as well. We also did a lot of, that was what we did for ourselves when we, for clients, we did a mix of using Office 365 as the platform for the single sign-on, and then, as Johanny mentioned, Okta, which is another third-party provider. And Matt could probably talk about, probably not in this context of this webinar, but there are reasons for choosing one or the other. Both have advantages and disadvantages. Back to you, Matt, I think.
Great, yeah. So the other thing I'll say on the password side is that we have gotten away from you know, the historical guidance, which is like, hey, you need to have a password, change it every 90 days. That's the most secure. You know, Microsoft and other people have done a lot of research and saying that that's actually a defeatist rule, because people don't actually choose good passwords in general, and so then when they're asked to change them frequently, they make poor modifications, and so they continue to choose bad passwords. So so the shift from have a password, change it every 90 days with no two-factor, that's really been changed now to pick a good password, a longer password, think passphrase, and then have a second factor is a much kind of better and more secure approach for an organization to adopt, as opposed to you know, pick a password, change it regularly because people forget and pick bad passwords. So yep. So we can talk, yeah, now transition a little bit to, you know, what I think Johan has identified as a continuing trend in consumerization.
Yeah, this will be quick. I just wanted to just mention sort of what we're seeing as far as the consumerization of IT trend goes. And this is something that really was a lot more popular and talked about 5 or 6 years ago, back in 2012, 2013. I think that was the point in time at which the iPhone really kind of achieved ubiquity. And there was a general sense that, the iPhone is so easy to use. Apple devices in general are so easy to use. That's going to kind of revolutionize the way in which people use technology at work. And I think what we've seen is that it hasn't necessarily happened in that way. And we've passed maybe what I would call sort of peak consumerization. And what we've noticed is that it's true that laptops are a lot more popular now than desktops. And in general, in the past, it was sort of like desktops were the default. And, if an organization was going to order laptops, they had to have sort of specific reasons and use cases for it. And now it's kind of flipped, where laptops are the default unless there's some specific reason to get someone a desktop. At the same time, laptops are, still very common. And, also 5 or 6 years ago, there was a general sense that, laptops might be replaced by tablets, which are a lot lighter. And we have not seen that to be the case at all. And I think, organizations that have tried to use tablets in lieu of laptops have been fairly disappointed with the results. And so laptops really don't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. We've also found sort of a reversal of the trend. More organizations were exploring using Macs and MacBooks, 5 or 6 years ago, and tried that for a little while. And I think we've started to see a lot of organizations going back to Windows. I think there are two main reasons for this. One is that Apple, particularly with the new MacBook line, has kind of doubled down on the consumer space. So the new MacBooks are very oriented towards consumer end user use and are not enterprise friendly at all. And Apple has not done much with the Mac OS software to make it more enterprise friendly. So it just tends to be more expensive to maintain Macs in a business environment. And secondly, Microsoft has done a lot to really integrate Windows with Office 365. And there are a lot of benefits, like some of the things Steve was talking about earlier with selective sync, that they just work better in a Windows environment. And as organizations use Office 365, they'll find that Windows just works better, in addition to being kind of easier to maintain in an enterprise environment. And then finally, mobile, was huge also 5 or 6 years ago, and mobile device management in particular was just kind of a huge solution space that was emerging. And we've seen that sort of disappear to some extent. And I think what the trend has been away from organizations trying to manage the mobile device, and instead manage their information on the mobile device and kind of stick it in containers that can be easily segmented from the rest of the device and easily removed in the event that the device is stolen or compromised. And there are some additional controls that organizations are starting to implement with regards to mobile devices. Matt, do you want to tell us a little bit more about these?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a little bit of the reaction and the pendulum swinging back from consumerization, kind of the bring your own device model that I think is, has been popular. A lot of the cloud services, it has been really easy to access your data from kind of any device. I think organizations are starting to identify and recognize that kind of complete open policy may not be the best. Again, kind of coming back to some of the examples, in kind of recent politics, like, if your email gets published on the front page of the New York Times, like how does that reflect on your organization, internal documents, how does that reflect? And so I think we're seeing organizations start to more tightly manage mobile devices so that, not just anything can connect to the corporate network. We talked a little bit earlier about initial steps to deal with information rights management. So Steve gave that good illustration of some controls that can be put on documents themselves so that if somebody forwards something to an outside source, if somebody's leaking data in your organization, if there's, if your organization has sensitive or confidential information, how can the organization kind of put up some roadblocks or some barriers on that information so that it doesn't get out, it doesn't it's harder for somebody to just kind of take data out of an organization and send it. I think in this space, the nonprofit sector, on the one hand, was really ahead of the curve in adopting cloud technologies, because I think in general nonprofits are more nimble. The donation program, certainly the free aspect, was really helpful for nonprofits to adopt the cloud on the front end, and so I think that's been a really positive thing. Kind of on the backside, nonprofits I think are well behind in terms of security and controls, because they don't have to in general. So again, kind of at the RSA conference, kind of encryption and two-factor authentication and information rights management is kind of standard in the enterprise. So I think some of that, information rights management is starting to kind of make its way into nonprofits as organizations kind of see the impact of what can happen when data gets out of an organization in a manner that they didn't want or expect it to. So I think that's something that organizations are going to be looking at a little bit more carefully, in 2018. I think it'll be pretty small. I mean, it might be board communication, it might be, kind of certain, strategy documents that get this applied. So I think it'll be the exception rather than the rule, but I definitely think that's coming. And then finally, as I mentioned, nonprofits tend to be a little bit behind the curve when it comes to security practices, because a lot of the stuff you're not required to do as an organization. HIPAA is a compliance that some organizations do have to face, but that's relatively small. And so we are starting to see more security good practices be requested or be demanded through actually the financial audit process. So IT security compliance is kind of coming from the accounting side.
Yeah. It actually relates to a question, and we'll get to Q&A here in just a minute, but there was a question as to whether or not PCI compliance has shifted away from the 90-day password change, and I don't believe it has. I think one of the things that we've noticed when it comes to compliance requirements is that they're not always, they're not always keeping up with, we're kind of moving through a pretty rapid time of change in terms of security best practices right now, and the compliance requirements aren't necessarily changing as rapidly as some of the recommendations. So, all the password recommendations, Microsoft is making changes to their recommendations based on what they're seeing, but that hasn't necessarily led to similar changes in the compliance requirements. And oftentimes, if you're in the process of, going through PCI compliance review or HIPAA compliance review, you may ask questions related to good security practices that fall on deaf ears because they really have nothing to do with the compliance requirements. So in some ways, there's almost sort of two strands of improved security, one that's being driven by compliance and one that's kind of being driven by all of these recent changes in the threat landscape. And they're not always the same. They're not always aligned. For example, I don't think HIPAA has any sort of multi-factor authentication requirement, even though the conventional wisdom now is that is far more secure than frequently changing complex password. So that's just something to keep in mind. Really quickly, we're out of time, but I think business intelligence is another area where we might see some changes in 2018, and a lot of that's being driven by Power BI. So once again, Microsoft giving us a free, like a puppy solution in Power BI. It's not exactly free; it's an extra feature. If you have Office 365, you have access to Power BI. If you want to share it with anyone, if you want to have any sort of automated synchronization with your data sets, then you'll need to pay extra for Power BI Pro. But it's there if you have Office 365, and it could be both the online and desktop versions. And if you're interested at all in data visualization, it's an interesting tool. It's very flexible. You can do a lot with it. It's very portable. It integrates with a ton of data sources. So it'll integrate, you can link it up to Excel spreadsheets that you have in your OneDrive. You can link it up to SQL databases. You can link it to your Google Analytics. So, and just a plethora, Salesforce, all kinds of data sources. I would say it's still at the beta level. There are features missing. Things don't always work the way you expect them to. They're innovating rapidly. They're releasing a new version every month, basically. A new version is kind of an overstatement, but they're constantly improving the features of Power BI. So if you're at all interested in data visualization at your organization, it really is a great tool. We'll probably do a webinar focused just on Power BI later this year. But if you do anything at all with spreadsheets, with pivot tables, Power BI really takes that all to the next level. So it's an interesting tool. All right, so that concludes the main portion of our webinar. We will move on to Q&A. Before we do, I would like to let everyone know that we have another webinar. We do these every month, almost always on the third Wednesday of the month. Next month, it will be February 21st from 4 to 5 o'clock. Next month, the webinar will be led by our information strategy partners, Build Consulting, and they're going to be talking about 5 hacks to weave constituent experience into your organization. So join us next month for that webinar. So now we've got a little bit of time for Q&A. We're right at 5 o'clock, but if anybody wants to stick around, we can stay here for 5 more minutes, 5 to 10 more minutes to do some Q&A. So let me see here. Got some questions. I'll just work from the bottom up. Any word on Office 365, Visio version of Office 365? Visio is the popular documentation utility. You can do a lot of visual documentation with Visio. Does anybody?
Yeah, I mean, it's there. I don't think there's nonprofit pricing for it.
Oh, okay.
But the licensing is available. There's a Visio online version.
Okay.
But I don't think it's part of the nonprofit SKU yet.
Got it. Okay. Let's see here. Hold on. Is there a good resource for best practices regarding Azure migration and federation?
I mean, Microsoft is fantastic in terms of like resources that they have and documentation for for kind of doing all of this stuff. So I mean, honestly, I would the Microsoft TechNet articles I think are very thorough in general for this kind of stuff, and they lay it out. The one problem is that a lot of their scenarios are geared towards 1,000-seat and up organizations. Like in the Microsoft world, if you're under 1,000 people, like everybody, kind of should be, kind of standalone or kind of cloud only accounts. So, it's geared a little bit big, but I think the documentation in general is pretty good.
Okay.
On that project that I mentioned, where we moved that 40-person organization to cloud only in terms of their server spaces, we did have these remote staff people who, if you were in the office, you could still connect to the Azure domain controller through the site-to-site VPN. But if you weren't in the office, if you had a home office, you were never going to connect to that Azure domain controller. So we just joined them directly to Azure AD, and they were Azure AD is all synced through Active Directory AD Connect, so that it all was synced already. But joining the actual computers, we used a product called Forenz IT, and we've used that for years for moving computers from one domain to another, or from a domain to a peer-to-peer network and whatever. And it's basically a profile migration tool. It's very inexpensive. It's essentially a manual process. You can, if you get to a scale of hundreds of computers, you can do some automation with it, certainly. But we generally have used it manually. But it does work. It when we were doing it this year, it was failing on us, and we were really wondering what we were going to do. And then we realized that we had the latest version had not been downloaded. So we downloaded the very latest version, which was like at that point like May of 2017, and then it supported joining to Azure Active Directory. So there are some tools out there that can be used.
Kind of related to that, what's your sense of how extensive third-party support is for single sign-on in Office 365, the Azure AD single sign-on?
It's great. I mean, there's a ton of pre-built integrations that are there, and so most Slack, Google Apps, Salesforce, we use Bamboo HR. I mean, all that stuff are kind of pre-built integrations, and it goes pretty well. The gotcha, I'll say, on the single sign-on is that so on the Office 365 side, you really need to have EM plus S E3, so that's $1.65 per user per month as a nonprofit. On the other side, you have to have a compatible version that supports single sign-on. So, for example, I know Ring Central, their regular business number for $30 a month doesn't support single sign-on. You have to go to their enterprise version, which is like $40 a month. So it's likely that you will need to upgrade the version of Slack, Box, whatever else you're using to support single sign-on. So I think that's the real gotcha on the single sign-on side. The setup is easy, although there's just a couple of places to fill in information. I have found that vendors can be a little slow in terms of updating their documentation. So you may have some back and forth, but once you turn it on, it's pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with everything Matt just said. I mean, I think it is worth sort of saying there are definitely cloud solution providers who lag, who haven't gotten with the program and got this protocol in their app, but they're getting fewer and far in between, and it's certainly not the big players, because this is the future. Everybody gets that. So and it's a generally agreed upon protocol. It's not like you have to build one thing for Office 365 and another thing to integrate with Okta. It's all using the same. And Matt, you could even say what it is. I can't remember, but it's got a name, that protocol.
Oh, SAML. That's
SAML, right?
Yeah. We have time for one more question, and it's actually kind of a summary of a couple questions, and it's basically related to SharePoint. To what extent? I mean, I think SharePoint obviously has a really spotty reputation for being complex, difficult to use, requiring a whole lot of overhead to set up, being kind of end user unfriendly, and overkill, frankly, for organizations that really just need a file server. And I think that is people's historical experience with SharePoint, and when they hear that SharePoint's available on Office 365, they're not jumping up and down for the opportunity to use it again. Is that, are those things all still the case with SharePoint? Is there a reason to be optimistic? What's sort of maybe the best way to phrase this is, what's the trend with SharePoint? And if someone has tried to use it and run into problems, or has a SharePoint installation that isn't working well, what are their options?
I'm sure Johanna has an opinion on this as well, and I may not be exactly in sync with her. I think one thing that happened, I think it might have been in 2017 to us, was that we realized that for all of the reasons that you just mentioned, Johan, probably thinking of SharePoint as my file server replacement is not the way to go. It is possible to replace a file server with SharePoint, but it's a lot of work, a lot of overhead, and it's the way to go. I think now the trend is, and less and less does Microsoft even present this as SharePoint. They talk more about spin up an Office 365 group or an Office 365 team, and when you do that, you get a cloud library, and you can add cloud libraries to it. It just so happens that those libraries are built on the SharePoint platform, so it is SharePoint at the end of the day. But but that you just spin those things up and that you start using them, you start using those spaces to share files sort of going forward. So my recommendation probably, if I had a small-ish nonprofit with a file server, would be maybe keep that file server around, but try to get people to start using Office 365 file spaces, whether they were Office 365 groups files or whatever. It's all SharePoint, but use Office 365 to share files for different needs that are constrained and focused. So I have a project, I have a grant, I have a finance department that needs to share these files. Let's do all that in Office 365, and we're not trying to move 15 years worth of 400 gigabytes of files into SharePoint in a huge project, because that is a big lift.
Mm-hmm.
But not to leverage what I consider to be really pretty terrific file sharing collaboration space that Office 365 provides, and to say we're only going to use our file server. I think that there's just too much cool stuff that you can do once you get your files in the cloud, sharing it externally, accessing it anywhere you have the internet, versioning, search, all these things that are not nearly as easy to do with a file server on premise.
Mm-hmm.
Johanny, did you have anything?
Yeah, no, I don't know if I think Microsoft is also making it easier for the user, where, even a couple of years ago, with the introduction of metadata, and you had to organize everything metadata, made it very, very difficult and challenging for the user. Now, more and more, I think Microsoft is making investments to use the SharePoint or document libraries as Dropbox, right? Using folders and all that, and making it easier for the user to move files across different libraries, different sites. So I think eventually, it's I see that the file server, can be I disagree with you a little bit on that, and not to move the whole archive. I agree, it doesn't make any sense. But I think for an organization to move forward and use the cloud or SharePoint for files makes sense. It will need a little work and push on user adoption, but yeah.
All right. Well, that's a bold prediction, Johanny, considering that Steve may or may not be in a spy agency, from what I heard earlier. No comment on that. We could probably use his old street address to hack into his system, though, and get an answer to that question. Anyhow, thank you all for your time today. This was very informative. I think 2018 is going to be another exciting year in technology, and I think a lot of I think we are reaching a solid plateau of productivity with a lot of these solutions, and some of them will kind of fade into the background and just become really usable. So it's exciting to look forward to. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to you joining us next month for the 5 Hacks webinar. Oh, and yes, one last question. Thank you. The slides and recording will be available afterwards. They're on our website, and we will also email them out to you. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.